A woman walks her dog behind an apartment building in Dartmouth. It's just past dawn, quiet, empty. Then she sees something near a fence, a shape, a smear of red. She steps closer and realizes she's found a body. Her name is Brenda Way, and within hours, police will decide they know exactly who killed her. They're wrong, and their mistake will lead to an innocent man going to jail for nearly 2 decades. The discovery of a body is rarely cinematic. There's no dramatic music, no detectives rushing in, no flashing lights. It almost always begins the same way, with ordinary people doing ordinary things. A person out walking, a neighbor taking out the garbage, someone cutting through a back lane they've used their entire life. That's how the morning of November 12th, 1995, begins behind 109 Albro Lake Road in Dartmouth. The sun hasn't fully committed to the day yet, just a thin wash of pale light stretching across the tops of the buildings. The air has that early winter bite to it, the kind that settles in your chest. The pavement is cold and rough, the alley narrow and cluttered with the usual, cracked asphalt, a dented dumpster, the bare outline of frost on the fence boards. A woman walks her dog here almost every morning. It's a habit as routine as breathing. She knows this alley, she knows where her dog usually stops. She knows which patch of pavement tends to puddle after heavy rain. She knows the rhythm of this place. And it's that familiarity, that instinctive, unconcerned rhythm that makes what happens next hit her harder. Her dog pulls toward the fence, not aggressively, not alarmed, just curious. Nose down, tail stiff. The woman follows his gaze and sees it, a shape on the ground. At first, it looks like discarded clothing, maybe a crumpled jacket, but then she sees the color, deep dark red against the concrete, and something inside her changes, a shift, a sudden undeniable understanding that she is about to step into someone else's nightmare. She walks closer, 2 steps, 3. Her dog hesitates now, ears alert. Then she sees the face. It's a woman, young, still, too still to be alive. The dog barks once, sharp, startled, and the woman recoils, a hand over her mouth. She fumbles for her phone, her fingers shaking, her breath loud in the cold air. The 911 call goes out just before sunrise. Within minutes, officers arrive. They slow their cruiser before they reach the alley. That practiced caution that comes from not knowing what you're walking into. The lights of the vehicle make the frost on the fences glow faintly pink and blue. The officers step out. Their boots crunch the gravel. One leads, one follows, and as they take in the scene, their posture shifts, their pace slows. Bodies tell stories, even before the evidence is processed. And this story is already speaking loudly. The victim is face up, her injuries visible even from a distance. Sharp force trauma, signs of blunt impact, bruising, a torn jacket, blood pooled in uneven patches where the pavement dips. Her hands show damage, the kind that comes from trying to fight back. This wasn't a sudden death. It wasn't quiet. Whatever happened here, it was violent, desperate, and personal. One officer radios it in. Another creates a soft perimeter with whatever he has available. A visual boundary to keep curious eyes back. Morning commuters will start passing this alley soon, and the last thing they need is a crowd gathering before the scene can be secured. Brenda Way, 28 years old. Her ID won't be confirmed for a little while, but officers know the community, and the community knows her. This part of Dartmouth is tight-knit in some ways, and hardened in others. People watch out for each other in the best ways they can, even when life is rough. And for Brenda, life had been rough. The first officers don't know that yet, but they can sense something about this scene. It feels isolating, tucked away, a place where someone could inflict enormous harm without being interrupted. The location starts to shape their thinking, the victim's injuries even more so. They begin to sweep their flashlights across the ground, slow, deliberate arcs of light. They look for a weapon, for blood drops beyond the pooling, for footprints or drag marks, for anything out of place. There is nothing, no knife, no obvious trace to follow. No signs of a struggle moving beyond this spot. It's as if the violence began here and ended here. In the early hours of an investigation, silence is dangerous. It forces people to fill the gaps with instinct, assumption, and narrative. And as the first officers stand in that alley with a young woman's body cooling in the dawn air, the silence is already shaping their thoughts. Someone did this. Someone who knew her, someone close, someone angry. That idea, the closeness of violence, becomes the investigation's gravitational center. And once it forms, it's almost impossible to shake. The alley grows brighter as morning fully arrives. More officers, more tape, more procedure. The woman who found Brenda stands off to the side, pale and shaking, answering questions through short, uneven breaths. Her dog sits beside her, whining softly. Brenda's body will soon be taken away. The alley will be cleaned. People will walk past again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. But for investigators, the path forward is already narrowing, and dangerously so. Because within hours of this discovery, the Halifax Regional Police will decide they know who killed Brenda Way. And once that conclusion settles in, it will take nearly 20 years to uncover how wrong they were. When you talk about a case like this, it's easy to let the violence define everything. The discovery of a body, the brutality of the injuries, the investigation that will soon spiral in the wrong direction. But a homicide isn't just a crime scene or a file number. It's a life, a person who existed long before the moment the world learned their name. Brenda Way lived a life that was complicated, painful, and often unprotected. But it was a life with texture, with relationships, with laughter, with history, and if you strip that away, you lose the meaning of the story entirely. Brenda was born into circumstances that didn't leave her much room to fall, and she fell hard more than once. She grew up in a household marked by instability, with frequent moves and inconsistent support. By her teens, she was bouncing between foster homes and group housing, trying to navigate a system that wasn't really built to help young women like her. The Halifax Examiner's Dead Wrong investigation later described this part of her life with a painful clarity. Brenda was one of those kids who slipped through every safety net, not because she was a problem, but because the nets themselves were full of holes. People who knew her back then remember a girl who could be bright and funny, someone who learned to be tough because softness wasn't safe. She had a sharp sense of humor, the kind that comes from growing up fast, learning to assess people quickly and knowing when to push back. She wasn't fragile, but she wasn't invulnerable either. She made friends easily, trusted slowly, and carried a lifetime of scars before she turned 20. By the early 1990s, Brenda was part of Halifax's street-based sex trade, a world shaped by poverty, violence, addiction, and survival. It was a dangerous place to exist, especially for women. The work itself was risky, but the environment around it was worse. Abusive partners, unpredictable clients, rivalries, drugs, and predatory men who understood exactly how little protection women like Brenda had. There were people who cared about her, sisters, friends, other women working the same streets who watched out for each other in the ways they could, passing along warnings, sharing cigarettes, splitting cheap meals, walking in pairs when something felt off. But the truth is, it was a world where danger sat close at all times. You could be thriving on a Tuesday and gone by Friday, and most of the city wouldn't even notice. Brenda had struggles with addiction. She fought it sometimes, lost to it other times. She had periods of stability and periods where everything seemed to collapse. But if you listen to the people who knew her, truly knew her, they don't talk about her as a stereotype. They talk about her as someone who wanted more, someone who dreamed of getting out of the cycle she was in. Someone who showed flashes of warmth and resilience even when things were falling apart around her. And then there was Glen Assoun. Their relationship was complicated, intense, and often volatile. It lasted for years in one form or another, sometimes romantic, sometimes adversarial, sometimes codependent in ways neither of them could fully control or escape. They argued, they reconciled, they split, they tried again. Anyone who's lived through a relationship like that knows. From the outside, it looks chaotic. From the inside, it can feel like the only connection you have left. By 1995, they had broken up again. There were tensions, accusations, hurt feelings on both sides. Friends later said Brenda wanted to move on, to distance herself from the drama that came with Glen, and from the violence she felt was always lingering just beneath the surface of their relationship. It's important to say this clearly. Their relationship was not healthy. There were moments of real harm, moments that made people uneasy, moments Brenda herself reportedly feared. But the leap investigators were about to make, that Glen's flaws and volatility must have culminated in murder, was not supported by evidence. What would soon become the foundation of the case against him began with something far simpler: familiarity. Police knew Brenda and Glen had history. They knew they argued. They knew the relationship was messy. And in criminal investigations, messy relationships can become irresistible starting points. But Brenda's world was bigger than one man. She was surrounded by people far more dangerous than Glen. Halifax in the mid-90s had its own share of predators, men who moved through the city unnoticed, who targeted vulnerable women, who stabbed and strangled and disappeared into the fog of the streets. Some of them were later convicted of multiple murders. Some of them were never caught. Some of them crossed paths with Brenda more directly than investigators ever explored. She was living in a community where violence was common, but not random. Women were attacked for refusing dates, for speaking up, for being in the wrong place when someone with a knife needed money, dominance, or a victim. It was a world full of danger, but also a world full of people who survived it every day. Brenda didn't, and that matters, because when someone like Brenda is killed, the easiest narrative is that the violence came from the closest person in her life. But the truth, especially in her story, is far more complicated. As police began to retrace her steps in the days before her death, they encountered a maze of people, places, grudges, and threats. But instead of following that maze outward, they followed it inward. They narrowed their field. They started drawing lines on a small part of the map and ignoring the rest. And once they did that, once Brenda was reduced to the ex-girlfriend of Glen Assoun, everything else, her life, her struggles, her community, the dangers that surrounded her, was quietly pushed to the margins. It's one of the most common failures in homicide investigations. When the victim's life is complex, investigators simplify it. When the victim faces systemic vulnerability, investigators assume the story is predictable. And when a victim has a turbulent relationship, that relationship becomes the entire lens through which the case is seen. That's what happened to Brenda. And that simplification, that unwillingness to look at the full world she lived in, is one of the reasons her murder remains unsolved today. Because when investigators narrowed their focus to one man, they turned their backs on all the others who were far more capable and far more likely to have committed the violence that ended her life. The first hours of any homicide investigation are crucial. Small details can become turning points. Offhand comments can become leads, and silence, the absence of evidence, can be as dangerous as any clue. Behind 109 Albor Lake Road, in those early morning hours of November 12th, investigators had silence, far too much of it. The scene gave them almost nothing. No weapon, no usable fingerprints, no signs of a robbery gone wrong, no witnesses who saw the attack. It was a void, cold, stark, and unforgiving. When investigators encounter a void, they start filling it, sometimes with hypotheses, sometimes with instinct, and sometimes with narrative. In this case, the narrative formed quickly. Brenda Way had been in a troubled relationship. She had recently argued with her ex. That ex was known to the police, and he had a temper. It wasn't evidence, but it was a story. And in the absence of physical clues, stories can become anchors. Once they take hold, everything else starts bending around them. But to understand how tightly that narrative gripped the investigation, you have to understand the environment Halifax police were operating in at the time. The mid-1990s were chaotic for law enforcement in the region. Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, and the county police forces were all in the middle of merging into a single new entity, the Halifax Regional Police. It was a massive restructuring. New leadership, new procedures, new territory, new expectations, and a long trail of internal disruptions. Officers were moving between units. Supervisors were shuffled. Caseloads grew uneven. Institutional memory, the quiet knowledge police forces rely on, was scattered. Imagine trying to solve a murder while the floor is shifting under your feet. That was the Halifax police in late 1995. Within that instability, Brenda's homicide landed on a desk that was already overflowing. Detectives were stretched thin, managing unfamiliar territory with unfamiliar colleagues. Pressure was high, resources were modest, and the victim was a street-involved woman, someone the system had historically failed to protect. So when the narrative pointing to her ex-partner emerged, it felt straightforward, clean, manageable, something they could grip. That ex-partner was Glen Assoun. But before investigators even spoke to him in depth, they began talking to people in Brenda's world, people on the streets, people in rooming houses, people whose lives intersected with hers through addiction, poverty, or shared danger. These weren't people living stable lives. Their memories were foggy, their loyalties shifted, their accounts were influenced by fear, friendship, substances, or pure speculation. And yet, these were the voices that would soon form the backbone of the case. One person mentioned hearing Brenda and Glen argue weeks earlier. Another suggested Glen had been jealous. Someone else said Brenda told them she felt unsafe. Those recollections may have been sincere, but they weren't necessarily tied to the night she died. Investigators heard what confirmed their growing theory, and stopped hearing what didn't. Here's an example of just how loose and unpredictable the investigation became. Almost 10 months after Brenda's death, her sister found a kitchen knife behind their mother's home. She reported that a psychic had told her where to look. The knife should have been a curiosity, irrelevant unless proven otherwise. Instead, it became part of the investigative orbit, a physical object investigators could point to, even though forensic analysis found no blood and no biological link to Brenda. The case was drifting, not because investigators didn't care, but because they were being pulled in different directions with no stabilizing evidence to hold them in place. And there's another layer to all this. Halifax in the mid-90s had a number of violent men operating in the shadows. Men who preyed on vulnerable women. Men with long histories of assault, threats, and knife attacks. Men who moved through the same areas Brenda lived and worked in. Some of these men were arrested for other crimes. Some were already on police radar for violence. Their names were known. Their patterns were known. Some even lived frighteningly close to where Brenda's body was found. But none of these men became the gravitational center of the investigation. Instead, police narrowed their focus as early as the first week, and that narrowing shows up in the paperwork. Reports that should have considered a broad range of suspects instead repeated the same insinuations. Witness interviews began asking pointed questions. Did Brenda ever say she was afraid of Glen? Did you ever hear him threaten her? Even people who initially said no sometimes changed their answers under pressure or repeated the rumors circulating on the street. This is how tunnel vision works, not as a dramatic turning away from truth, but as a slow and subtle narrowing, a gentle turning of the dial until everything outside the frame fades. The more investigators leaned toward Glen, the fewer steps they took elsewhere. Potential suspects weren't pursued with the same urgency. Timelines involving other men in Brenda's life became blurry or unexplored. Scenes that weren't directly connected to Glen received less attention. And the sad truth is this: investigations don't always collapse because of corruption or malice. Sometimes they collapse because the system around them is overloaded, chaotic, and unprepared. And sometimes they collapse because the simplest explanation feels safest. A volatile former partner, a history of arguments, a victim who hadn't been protected in life, and whose death didn't command political pressure. It was enough to make investigators feel they were on the right path, even when the evidence didn't follow. By the time the first major reports were filed, the path forward was clear. Glen Assoun wasn't just a suspect, he was the suspect. And once that status hardens around someone, the investigation stops asking, "Who did this?" and starts asking, "How do we prove it was him?" A homicide investigation doesn't derail all at once. It happens slowly, through dozens of small choices that seem reasonable on their own. By the time Glen Assoun walked into a courtroom in 1999, the case against him had been shaped by 4 years of decisions, some sloppy, some biased, some simply careless, but together enough to lock him into a story he couldn't escape. To understand how the jury convicted him, you have to see what the courtroom actually looked like. Not physically, though it was a standard Halifax courtroom, wooden benches, fluorescent lights, a judge presiding over a room that felt both official and impersonal. But structurally, what evidence came in, what evidence didn't, what stories were told, which were ignored. Let's start with something that should stand out immediately. There was no physical evidence tying Glen to Brenda's death. Not a fingerprint, not a hair, not a fiber from his clothing, not a drop of blood. Nothing. In most homicide trials, that absence would become a focal point. Defense lawyers would raise it repeatedly. They'd question the investigators' assumptions. They'd challenge the forensic gaps. They'd push the jury to ask whether a lack of physical evidence made sense in a killing as violent and up close as Brenda's. But Glen didn't have a defense lawyer. Midway through the pre-trial process, overwhelmed and distrustful, he fired the lawyer representing him. It was a decision born of frustration, paranoia, and the belief that no one was really listening to him. Whatever the reasons, the result was catastrophic. He ended up representing himself at his own murder trial. Imagine standing in a courtroom, facing the most serious charge there is, and having to perform every role yourself, questioning witnesses, challenging inconsistencies, objecting to improper testimony, preparing legal submissions, all while dealing with grief, fear, and an entire justice system that already believes you did it. That's what Glen walked into. The Crown's case rested almost entirely on witness testimony, and not the kind of testimony you hope for in a homicide case. Many of the witnesses were street-involved, struggling with addiction, or carrying criminal charges of their own. Their memories were inconsistent. Their statements shifted over time. Some contradicted themselves. One would later recant. But in a courtroom, stability doesn't come from a witness's lived reality. It comes from presentation. And every witness who hinted at Glen's guilt was presented as credible. A jailhouse informant claimed Glen confessed to the murder while they were incarcerated together. This informant received significant benefits for his cooperation, something the jury never fully grasped. Another witness claimed Glen made incriminating statements months before Brenda's death, but her own account shifted depending on who she was speaking to at the time. Her reliability wasn't questioned in front of the jury. Other witnesses spoke about arguments between Glen and Brenda, fights, threats, emotional chaos. None of this pointed to the night of the murder, but it painted a picture of Glen as volatile, jealous, capable of sudden rage. And in a courtroom, stories about who someone is can sometimes eclipse the question of what actually happened. Because Glen represented himself, he had to cross-examine these witnesses personally. Imagine trying to do that with people you once lived with, people who knew your flaws, people who could bend parts of the truth in ways you couldn't untangle alone. Every question he asked was second-guessed by prosecutors. Every objection he raised was overruled. Every attempt to challenge credibility was met with the polished counter-arguments of trained Crown attorneys. The trial became uneven, not because Glen lacked sincerity, but because he lacked skill. A homicide trial is a battlefield, and he was sent into it without armor. Then there was the matter of alternative suspects. We know now, decades later, that RCMP analysis suggested Brenda may have been killed by serial killer Michael McGray or another violent offender, Avery Greeno. But none of that information was disclosed at trial, not a word of it. To the jury, the world outside Glen simply didn't exist. They were presented with one narrative, the jealous ex-partner who snapped. Meanwhile, the forensic gaps, the complete absence of physical evidence, were reframed not as red flags, but as unimportant. The lack of a murder weapon wasn't raised as a failure. The missing DNA wasn't discussed. The knife found through a psychic wasn't questioned for its absurdity. What should have been treated as a case full of holes was delivered as a case full of certainty. And in 1999, after a trial that lasted only a few weeks, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Glen was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 18 years. He stood there in a courtroom that had become a funnel, narrowing, until only one outcome was possible. Brenda's family believed briefly that justice had been served. Police closed the file, prosecutors moved on, and the real killer, whoever he was, continued living in the world, untouched. But wrongful convictions don't reveal themselves immediately. They sit quietly for years, buried under paperwork, buried under certainty, buried under the weight of a system that rarely admits its mistakes. And Glen, now branded a murderer, began the longest, hardest chapter of his life. When the courtroom emptied and the verdict settled, Glen Assoun entered a new kind of life, one defined by concrete, steel, and the bitter knowledge that the world believed he murdered the woman he loved. A homicide sentence doesn't just remove years from someone's life. It removes credibility. It removes any presumption of goodness. It removes the ability to be heard. And for Glen, that silence was suffocating. He arrived in federal custody insisting on the same thing he'd been saying since the beginning. I didn't kill Brenda, but innocence inside prison walls doesn't mean anything. Everyone says they're innocent. Everyone claims a mistake was made. And Glen, representing himself at trial, convicted on witness testimony, was seen as textbook guilty. Prison is not kind to men convicted of harming women. Glen became a target instantly. He was moved frequently because of threats, fights, and intimidation. His mental health deteriorated. He developed severe anxiety, depression, and physical ailments that went untreated for years. He paced cells, wrote letters, filed grievances, begged for people to look at the evidence he didn't have. Wrongful convictions often fracture people slowly, grinding them down until they become unrecognizable, shadows of who they were. Glen fought that erosion for nearly 2 decades. But to understand his fight, you also have to understand the world outside, because while Glen was sitting in a prison cell, something remarkable was developing far beyond the walls. A quiet, methodical re-examination of Brenda Way's murder. And that story begins with a man named Dave Moore. Moore was an RCMP analyst working with the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System. His job wasn't to solve individual murders. His job was to look at patterns, weapon choices, victim types, injuries, geography, timelines. A kind of forensic cartography of violence. Around 2004, Brenda Way's case came across his desk. What he saw immediately bothered him. The injuries, the level of force, the location, the victim profile. It didn't read like a crime of passion by an ex-partner. It read like a predator attack. And in Halifax at the time of Brenda's murder, there was a predator active, Michael Wayne McGray. McGray was not just violent, he was uncontrollably violent. A serial killer whose murders were driven by bloodlust, opportunity, and rage. He murdered strangers. He murdered acquaintances. He murdered without hesitation and without remorse. Some of his known crimes involve slashing and stabbing attacks on women living on the margins. Women not unlike Brenda. Moore began digging. He pulled timelines. He pulled offender history. He cross-referenced geography. He examined the brutality of Brenda's wounds against McGray's known patterns. He identified overlaps, disturbing overlaps. McGray wasn't just a possible suspect. He was a compelling one. And McGray wasn't the only name that surfaced. Moore also flagged Avery Greeno, a violent man with a history of attacks against sex workers in the same region. Greeno lived closer to Brenda than Glen did. His behavior, his record, his proximity, it all fit. Moore compiled his findings meticulously. He did what analysts are trained to do. He built a file that should have changed everything, a file that should have been disclosed to Glen, a file that should have forced investigators to reopen the case. But that disclosure never happened. Instead, the file disappeared. Internal systems shifted. Reports were removed. Analyses were lost or destroyed. The details vary depending on who you ask, but the result is undeniable. Evidence identifying 2 highly plausible suspects never reached Glen's defense team. And Glen remained in prison, unaware that someone on the outside had seen enough to cast enormous doubt on his guilt. Years passed. Glen's physical and mental health worsened. He suffered heart issues, insomnia, crippling anxiety, and chronic pain. He lived in isolation for extended periods because it was safer than general population. His relationships with family strained under the weight of distance and shame. But he never stopped writing. He wrote to anyone who would listen, and eventually, someone did. Innocence Canada, then known as the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, received a letter from Glen. It was one of thousands they receive every year, but something about his case didn't sit right. No forensic evidence, a self-represented defendant, witnesses with reliability issues, rumors of alternative suspects, and then they learned about the missing RCMP files. That changed everything. What began as a surface-level review became a full reinvestigation. Lawyers and researchers dug into archives, transcripts, statements, and death records. They interviewed people connected to Brenda. They spoke to witnesses again, and some admitted they had lied or repeated rumors, or were under the influence when they spoke to police. Piece by piece, the scaffolding of Glen's conviction began to shake. Innocence Canada submitted a formal application for a federal conviction review, an extraordinary remedy reserved for the most serious miscarriages of justice. It is not granted lightly. But Glen's case was different. It had the hallmarks of collapse. Years of pressure built, until finally, in 2014, something Glen had almost given up hoping for happened. He was granted bail pending the outcome of the review. After nearly 17 years of imprisonment and restrictions, Glen walked out of prison a free man. Not exonerated, but no longer inside. A man in limbo. He had lost most of what anchored him, his health, his relationships, his sense of safety. But he also gained something he hadn't had in years, a chance to be heard. And the truth, the full, terrible truth, was finally beginning to surface. When Glen Assoun walked out of prison on bail in 2014, most people assumed his case was simply another long-shot appeal, a procedural pause, not a turning point. But behind the scenes, the walls of his conviction were beginning to crack, not because of new technology or a miraculous confession, but because someone finally held a flashlight up to the dark corners of the original investigation. That flashlight belonged to the Criminal Conviction Review Group, or CCRG, the federal body that examines miscarriages of justice. Few cases reach this level, fewer still result in any action. But Glen's case raised every alarm they had. No forensic evidence, problematic witnesses, a self-represented defendant, and whispers of undisclosed RCMP work pointing toward violent alternate suspects. So CCRG investigators did what no one else had done thoroughly since the 1990s. They started pulling every thread. What they found was disturbing. Some of the most important information came from digging into the RCMP's internal violent crime linkage analysis system database, the same system analyst Dave Moore had used to link Brenda's murder to known violent offenders. Those linkages didn't just hint at other suspects. They pointed with startling clarity to men with histories of brutal attacks, men who lived near Brenda, men whose violence matched her injuries in ways Glen never could. At the top of that list was Michael Wayne McGray, one of Canada's most dangerous serial killers. McGray was known for sudden, frenzied stabbing attacks on vulnerable victims. He lived in the region at the time Brenda was murdered. His known crimes carried the same signature: explosive violence, knives, victims caught off guard, women living on the margins. Brenda's homicide fit his pattern like a missing puzzle piece. Another man, Avery Greenough, also matched several aspects of the crime: violent, volatile, known to police for targeting women in the exact neighborhood Brenda lived and worked in. The RCMP analysis didn't treat these men as vague possibilities. It listed them explicitly as high-probability alternate suspects. That alone would have been enough to raise doubt in Glen's trial. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the alternate suspects. It was what happened to the files. When CCRG investigators attempted to locate the original analyses Moore had produced, the documented links to McGray and Greenough, they discovered that key portions of those files had been deleted, overwritten, or destroyed. Decades-old systems can fail, but this wasn't random deterioration. This was disappearance on a scale that suggested something went terribly wrong. Entire investigative notes missing, cross-references gone, alternate suspect files wiped from existence. Moore himself later testified that he believed his work had been intentionally erased. Maybe not by a malicious actor, maybe not through some grand conspiracy, but erased nonetheless. And if those files had survived, Glen Assoun would not have been convicted. The CCRG reached a devastating conclusion. The jury who convicted Glen was never given a complete or accurate picture of the investigation. They never heard about the violent men who fit the crime better than Glen. They never heard about the matching behavioral patterns. They never saw the RCMP analysis. They never knew the investigation had other leads, stronger leads, that could have changed everything. The foundation of Glen's conviction began to crumble. Meanwhile, Innocence Canada continued their own work, re-interviewing witnesses from the 1990s. Some admitted they were high on drugs when they gave statements. Some said they'd been pressured. One acknowledged that the story she told police, the one that strongly implicated Glen, wasn't true. Another witness, a jailhouse informant, had been given incentives the Crown never disclosed. Piece by piece, the story prosecutors told the jury in 1999 was collapsing. By early 2019, the federal justice minister received the CCRG's final report. Its message was unambiguous. There is a reasonable basis to conclude that a miscarriage of justice likely occurred. That phrase, miscarriage of justice, is the legal equivalent of a fire alarm. On March 1, 2019, in the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, Glen sat quietly as Crown attorneys rose and did something almost unheard of. They told the judges they would not defend the old conviction. They offered no evidence to retry him. They acknowledged the evidence pointing to other suspects. They conceded that Glen should never have been found guilty. The court quashed his conviction immediately. No conditions, no ambiguity, no more prison. 17 years after losing his freedom, Glen was officially exonerated. But exoneration is not the same as restoration. Glen's health was irreparably damaged, his relationships strained or broken. Years of life, the irreplaceable kind, had been taken from him while the real killer walked free. And the collapse of the case left one final, impossible question hanging in the air. If Glen didn't kill Brenda Way, then who did? When Glen Assoun walked out of the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, a free man, a new truth settled over Brenda Way's case, one that had been ignored for nearly 25 years. If Glen didn't kill her, someone else did, and that someone had likely been known to police all along. The strongest suspect is a man whose name was barely whispered during the original investigation, Michael Wayne McGray. McGray wasn't just violent, he was a predator driven by impulse and opportunity. A serial killer who stabbed and slashed his victims with a level of rage that often left crime scenes chaotic and frenzied. He murdered strangers, he murdered acquaintances, he murdered whenever the urge overtook him. At the time Brenda was killed, McGray was living in the Halifax area. He had access, he had the pattern, he had the capability, and the brutality of Brenda's injuries aligned disturbingly well with what McGray was already known for. RCMP analyst Dave Moore flagged this connection long before Glen's trial. In fact, he documented multiple behavioral similarities between Brenda's murder and McGray's attacks. But those analyses never reached the courtroom. They were buried through deletion, neglect, or something more intentional, and Glen became the easy answer. McGray wasn't the only suspect either. Another violent man, Avery Greenough, lived close to Brenda and had a history of attacking women in the community. His violence was unpredictable, explosive, and driven by the same kind of rage investigators saw in Brenda's wounds. He was the kind of offender who should have been interviewed immediately. Instead, he was barely considered. Both of these men with long, documented histories of violence, fit Brenda's homicide far better than Glen ever did. But the truth is this: modern investigators can't confirm who killed Brenda Way. Too much evidence has been lost. Too many files were destroyed. Too many witnesses have passed away or faded into silence. And the people most likely responsible, McGray and Greenough, are no longer alive to answer for their movements that night. What remains is a chilling reality. The most credible suspects were overlooked for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with tunnel vision. Brenda's family lost justice. Glen lost nearly 2 decades of his life. And the killer, whoever he was, lived freely while an innocent man sat in a cell. It's one of the most devastating consequences of wrongful convictions. The real perpetrator disappears into the background, protected not by cunning, but by the system's mistakes. When the court finally cleared Glen Assoun's name, the legal system corrected a mistake, but the damage it left behind was far beyond what any ruling could repair. Glen walked out of that courtroom an innocent man, but innocence didn't return the years he lost. It didn't restore his health, his relationships, or the time with family that slipped away while he sat in a cell for something he didn't do. He left prison carrying the weight of 2 lives, his own, fractured by a wrongful conviction, and Brenda's, because her murder was still unsolved. And that's the other half of this tragedy. Brenda Way was a real person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, whose death was overshadowed by the conviction of the wrong man. While Glen fought for his freedom, Brenda's case drifted. Leads went cold, files went missing, witnesses moved, disappeared, or died. The focus on Glen meant the investigation into the actual killer stalled almost immediately. Today, her murder officially remains unsolved. And that matters. Because Brenda deserved better than the assumptions that shaped her case. She deserved a full investigation. She deserved the kind of attention that victims on the margins rarely receive. She deserved justice, not a shortcut. Wrongful convictions don't just punish the innocent, they protect the guilty. They leave families without answers. They erode trust in the institutions meant to keep us safe. For Brenda's family, the pain never faded. For Glen, the fight to rebuild what's left of his life continued up until his death in 2023. And for the justice system, this case stands as a reminder that certainty is dangerous when it comes too easily. A young woman was killed, an innocent man was imprisoned, and the truth, the full truth, slipped through the cracks for decades. We tell stories like this not to reopen wounds, but to make sure they're not repeated. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again.
Thanks for staying with us through this one. Cases like this stay with you, and knowing how Glen's story ended, it hits even harder.
He was exonerated in 2019, and then he passed away just a few years later, in 2023. After everything he went through, he barely had any time to live freely again.
And the way he was treated after his release, it's heartbreaking. He did eventually receive a compensation settlement, but there was no public apology from the province, from the feds, from Halifax police, from anyone. Not a single institution stood up and acknowledged what they put him through.
Meanwhile, he was living in poverty for years after getting out. His health was gone. He didn't have stable housing. He didn't have the kind of support you'd expect after nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment.
And that's where the comparison to episode 9, the Paul Morin case, becomes impossible to ignore. Morin was publicly exonerated, publicly apologized to, and compensated in a way that recognized the magnitude of the harm. That didn't erase the trauma, but it showed that the system understood it owed him something.
Glen didn't get that. He got a settlement behind closed doors, and that was it. No apology. No real accountability for the destruction of evidence. No explanation for how alternate suspect files vanished. His family is still asking those questions even after his death.
And that's the real difference. Morin was lifted up and acknowledged. Glen was quietly paid and left to struggle with the fallout alone. And he didn't live long enough to see any kind of reckoning for the mistakes that nearly destroyed him.
And at the center of it all is Brenda. Her murder hasn't been solved. The men most likely responsible, McGray and Greeno, were never held accountable. And the investigation that should have protected her ended up failing Glen instead.
3 people lose in stories like this: the victim, the wrongly convicted, and the families who spend decades trying to make sense of what happened. If tonight's episode connected with you, if it made you rethink how these cases unfold, join us in the conversation. We're on X and YouTube, and your comments and shares really do help keep attention on cases that deserve it.
And it keeps pressure on the institutions that still haven't answered for what went wrong. Not in Brenda's case, not in Glen's, and not in others like Morin's. We'll be back next Monday. Until then, take care of each other.